dimension, but a very powerful one. So the title, Words Create the Path on Which We Walk. NLP is my topic, it has been for a long time. So Neuro Linguistic Programming. And I think it's no coincidence that linguistic is right in the middle of that. It's at the heart of it, the linguistics, the language that we use. It was very much the foundational work that the founders of NLP worked with, the patterns in language, the structure of how we say things. And I'm particularly drawn to that side of NLP. I think it's especially important, how we speak, not only to other people, but to ourselves. We're probably the person that we speak to the most, and what effect we have on ourselves when we do that. So it's very significant. And writing and words come through in emails, in text messages, so it's not confined to just spoken. Often people ask me, well, you know, how can you study this on any other medium? Well, there's all ways in which we speak, whether we're on the phone or whatever medium. So it's the linguistic side, especially, that I'm concentrating on this evening, and just a part of it because it's a huge topic. And they do create the path on which we walk, in the sense that I believe that the words we use influence what happens next. So we shape our experience based on the kind of language that we're using, either internally or with other people, hugely. And I suspect that most people, in my experience, is that most people don't necessarily think carefully about their words. And that's not always appropriate. But I think sometimes we speak without really considering the purpose that we seek to achieve. So even before I kind of get into this, you might want to think about, I mean, I guess you're at all different times of the day, and think about any conversations you have had already, either with yourself or with other people, and what's been the effect of those conversations. I mean, very often they can result in feelings, or they can result in information. But for example, have you felt exhilarated, excited, confused, frustrated? You know, what's been your reaction to any conversations that you've had? And then the question is, and you can write these in the text box if you wish. The question is, what created that? What was it that? And that's what we usually don't know. So NLP is very much the study of what's happening, study of our experience. And so often things happen in our lives, in our conversations, in our experiences, and we don't always know the cause of them. So let's go to the next slide. So Tracy's going to switch over. And this is where I am right now. It's actually getting to be nighttime, so this is a daytime picture. And I put that up because so often people say to me, well, does this work anywhere in the world? You know, if you're studying language, or if you're teaching about language, surely it's going to be different. And yes, it is, and that's the whole point. It's a way of studying what that difference is and how we can learn from that. So there's very different ways of expressing things. I mean, apart from the language itself, there's very different ways of expressing things here in France. I mean, people are much more likely to say, one goes, one will do this. We'd be much less likely to say that in the UK, for example. It's more, in a way, dissociated, but in France, it's an expression of community. So the point I'm making is that, I mean, I work in many different countries in the world, is that it's a way of studying what is important in that language. So I've just come back from Greece, and I had different reactions to some of the things that were said there. So for example, if I asked the Greek delegates on the program and my hosts, you know, can we do this? Very typically they'd say, of course we can. Of course we can. And I thought, well, that sounds like they're a bit affronted by my question, that maybe I shouldn't have asked it. And that happened quite a number of times. You know, I'd say, you know, can we have this? Of course we can. I thought, well, okay. And we eventually talked about this, and that's the beauty of feedback. We talked about it, and they said how very reserved the English delegates were, that we would say, thank you, yes. And that's a very Greek way of saying yes, of being enthusiastic. And I had taken it differently at first. I'd taken it as like, you shouldn't ask that question. And it didn't mean that at all. So just wherever we go, it's important not to make assumptions about the language. And so wherever you are in the world, I think this is an opportunity. And this is an opportunity for us to understand each other's language. And therefore, I really believe, hopefully create a much greater connection with people around the world. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And this was actually my view this morning. So it's autumn here in France, and it was very misty. It's a typical autumn mist. And I thought that was very appropriate metaphorically, in the sense that I know what's in this view. I know what's beyond those mists, and it's concealed at the moment. And that's very much like language, that what we get on the surface is very different to what's underneath. There's lots of things happen with the way that we think about our experience and the way we express it, again, to ourselves and to other people, that actually, if you like, hides the truth of what's actually there. And so I thought it couldn't have been a more appropriate image to share with you in that sense. And that's one of the things that we're going to explore is, well, how do we get through that mist, to continue to use that metaphor? So let's go to the next slide as well. You might wonder what on earth this is. Have I got a wrong slide dropped in the presentation? But this is the way that I work as well. Those of you who've trained with me will know that I tend not to go straight for theory. NLP is a study of experience, and particularly current experience. And Akrityr was one of the places that I was taken to visit when I was working in Santorini last week in Greece. And so this is an excavation of centuries old civilization. It was a civilization, a place that was first of all hit by earthquakes, and then there was a volcano eruption. And so a bit like what's the name of the other place where Mount Etna covered everybody? It's similar to that. And what they have done is to gradually uncover what was beneath the surface. So that by uncovering that, they're discovering all about this culture that used to exist there, which is just amazing. It's just fascinating. But one of the things that one of my friends with me said, it would be interesting if they made any assumptions about what was there. So it might be tempting to think, oh, this looks like a road. And to actually cut it out on that basis, which of course would be a great mistake. It's absolutely vital to really find out what's there and to go into it not knowing and without assumptions. And that's one of the qualities that makes a difference in the way that we deal with other people's language and our own, is how to step back and be curious about what people are saying in such a way that we discover the truth beneath the surface. So I thought, yes, I hadn't realized that when I went there, how significant that was going to be, a bit like the mist this morning in France, that they're uncovering bit by bit and learning about these people who lived centuries ago as a consequence of that. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to go through some of the patterns in language. Now, I know that some of you will have experienced these, have actually studied them, maybe explored them, played with them before. But it's one of those topics that I think the more we pay attention to it, the more we can learn. And one of the things I used to do when I taught language patterns, and this is one of the the main ones, abstractions, you know, given that this is probably the way that most everyday conversations take place, with abstract terms, with terms that have been used to collectively describe our experience in some way, given that it would just take far too long to describe our experience in detail. So it's appropriate to use abstractions. But the consequence of that is that we don't really know what we mean. We don't really know what somebody else means. Now, sometimes that may not be too important, but there are many times when it is. But what I used to do when I introduced language patterns was to go through them, as I am beginning to do here. But then I encourage people to learn them. And I still think that's very valuable. You know, it's one of the most useful things. If you're a coach, especially, or if you're a trainer, or you're somebody who works with, it's the way you work with other people is important. Being able to recognize patterns in language is probably one of the most important skills. So I used to ask people to learn them, but I realized over time that when I actually studied what I did, was the way I recognize, because often people have asked me, well, how do I recognize patterns in language quickly, which I do. I've practiced it for years. And I realized it wasn't only because I'd learned the patterns, it was because of the feelings that I got when I experienced different types of patterns in language. And I realized that was my quick route in to be able to identify what was happening. And so that's one of the things I'm going to introduce with these patterns, is how you might use your, what we call, to use the kind of more technical NLP term, kinesthetic response to what's happening. How to use that as a trigger to find out, well, so what's happening linguistically here? And then being aware of the patterns is the first step, being able to spot them. What you do next, there's lots of possibilities, and that depends on the outcome that you've got. So, for example, with abstractions, I mean, there's some examples there. We've taken behaviors, very specific behaviors, and grouped them together. When people talk about the skills that they've got in life, in work, they often use an abstraction to describe them. Companies talk about them, planning and organizing, listening skills, communication skills. They're abstractions. One way of identifying them, people will say, if you can't pick it up and put it in a wheelbarrow, if you can't touch it, it's an abstraction. And for example, when I'm running programs, I might say to people at the end of an exercise, well, how was that? What was your experience of that? And very often the response will be, well, it's interesting, or it was good. And they're using an abstraction. Now, it's nice to know that they've liked it, but it doesn't actually inform if it stays at that level. And there's times when to be informed is very important. So my outcome when I'm working with groups is for other people to learn from each other's experience. And so it's important to explore the abstraction and find out what people mean by that. Then the detail, the specifics, actually convey learning, whereas the abstractions don't. And the other thing I'd say about abstract terms is that if you read, really good authors, best-selling books, they don't tend to deal in abstractions. They're very rich, they're very sensory rich. They'll talk about what they're seeing, what they're hearing, what they're feeling. If you're ever in the business of writing, telling stories, telling metaphors, it's the richness of the communication, not the abstractions. And on the other hand, what I will say about it is that there's no rights or wrongs about this. So abstractions have a place, everything has a place. And for example, this kind of language is very often used in hypnotic language. And the reason for that is that if you're faced with an abstraction and you want to understand it, if you're not asking a question, then you need to go inside yourself to make sense of the word. And the minute you go inside yourself, you go into a trance. So if you're on the receiving end of a series of abstractions, the chances are you're going to go into this kind of downtime, this hypnotic state. So they're used in hypnosis. So they have a place. They have other places as well. But it's to emphasize the fact that there's no absolute rights or wrongs. It always depends on the outcome that you have for yourself. So those are just a few more examples at the bottom. It was a difficult conversation, but it doesn't say what about it was difficult. That was interesting, which is a classic response in training. But what about it? Now, if we find out what's below the surface, what somebody finds is interesting, that's useful to other people present potentially, but it also enables me or whoever else to learn about that person and what they find interesting. There'll be a unique meaning of that for them. And it just gives so much more valuable information when we get below the surface. So it would be one thing to be apparently in Akrityr in Santorini, it's a massive site that's undercover where they've excavated. And it's only 5% of the whole village that was covered. There's 95% still to be uncovered. You think, goodness me, imagine the time it's going to take to discover. And that's typically the case. There's a lot more to be discovered than we initially experience. So that's one of the very typical patterns in language, just to be aware of and to make decisions about. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Now, this is an interesting, well, interesting for me. I took this picture today. I've actually had delegates on my programs here in France go to this restaurant. France is very famous for food, although I must say that it's changing quite a lot in terms of whether they lead in the world now or not. And so some of the delegates on my program went to different restaurants to study what we call in NLP terms, model, ideally excellence. However, in this restaurant, and this is a very typical picture, this is on quite an open road, it's a throughway. There's a sign to the right that says open, ouvert, but there's nobody there. And that's the typical picture. There's nobody there. No more than a few miles away, that are packed at the same time of the day. So, it's interesting to say, well, what's the difference? And that's the strapline with NLP. What's the difference that makes the difference? And you might say, well, it's the food, and it may be. But very often the difference that makes the difference is what we're doing, what we're saying. And in this particular case, I'd been there with a friend. And the friend with me at the time is a very, very successful chef who has an experience of turning restaurants around, of making unsuccessful places very successful. And we were looking very sadly at this place and the delightful couple who run it. And they were talking to us and saying how difficult it was. And it was interesting that they were talking in terms of predominantly problems, which you would expect because of their lack of business. And we'd already said, well, should we offer, any feedback to them? But, to jump in and offer feedback when it hasn't been asked isn't really appropriate. It's jumping into an unhealthy role of rescuing. However, on our way, as we were just about to leave, my friend said, I said, I can understand, it must be hard for you, which is what they'd said. I have a lot of experience in turning restaurants around and bringing business into them. And I thought, here's the opportunity. Here is their opportunity. This is a moment when they could open the door in every sense of the word. And it was very interesting what they did next. I should ask you the question, what do you think? It's like one of those competitions, isn't it? What do you think they did next? Well, Tracy just gave it away with a glimpse there. Well, they didn't do that. They actually didn't do that, if you saw that slide. What they said next was, yes, we think that people are jealous of us around here, that we're not popular, we've got these problems. And what was interesting was that they continued to talk about the problems. What they didn't do was ask a question. And they'd no idea. I don't know if you've read The Alchemist, but it's like the answer to our questions in life and what we're searching for in life is very often right in front of us. And the question is, how do we find them? And I wished that they would just ask the question, because I knew that my friend would tell them, some of the experience that he had. And we left, and I was hoping, as we cycled away, that they would shout down the road and say, "Oh, hang on a minute, in what way did you turn these restaurants around?" And they didn't. And it was tragic, really. So let's go to that next slide now, Tracy. Because what they didn't do was to use what's known as a clean question. It's part of, I'll tell you who David Grove is. What they could have done, and what I was kind of wishing that they would do, is to say, turn them around in what way? And who knows what difference that would have made. But it would have given them the chance to have heard about someone who has experience in that. And the opportunity was to ask a clean question. Now, I teach clean questions, and I think when people first experience them, they go, well, they're unusual. I'll explain the format of them now. They're unusual, they're not familiar. Although they look simple, they're actually quite challenging to ask. But that experience in that restaurant, for me, demonstrated how powerful one clean question could have been. I don't know exactly what would have been the outcome, but I do believe it would have opened the door. So a clean question is to say, and. Now, there's a lot, the term very often used in NLP is presupposed. There's a lot presupposed in an and. If somebody says but, it presupposes they're going to dispute what you're saying. But to say and means I'm going to go with what you're saying, and I'm going to add something to it. Now, statistically, and I've done a lot of work in the past of studying the effect of language, when someone agrees with something and builds on it, the chances that the other person will listen and say yes to what they suggest is statistically so much higher. So an and is a very significant, very influential word when it's meant. So to say and then to say the other person's words, so in that case of the restaurant, and turn them around. So that means they've listened to the other person, that they've heard those words, that they recognize there's more to those words than's on the surface. They're curious about them, and they're asking for more. So to say, and turn around in what way? That could have been, it just could have been a magical moment. So David Grove was the person who was the source of this language. He was a remarkable therapist who I had the privilege to see and to work with for a little while. Unfortunately, he died quite young. And this was one of the approaches that he used, and that his principle was to keep yourself. He always said that you could say therapist, but you could say anybody, that when you're curious about somebody else's experience, the principle is to keep yourself to a minimum. So the questions don't have I or me, they're completely other-centered. They're built on the fact that you've listened, you've heard, you've remembered, you're curious, and you want to know more. So just so any questions anybody would like to ask or comments on what I've said so far, because I'm going to mix in this clean language. I sometimes in the past I've done things very distinctly, like clean questions and then language patterns of a different kind, and really they all work together. That's how I use them, and so we're going to mix them together. But this is one very significant way of getting below the surface. So anybody like to type any comments up there? I know some of you have covered this before. Or whether you can recall even any situations where one question like that could have made the difference, and how often they're not asked. That's what amazes me when I'm out and about. I see so many opportunities when people say their own stuff to each other, but don't explore the other person's. And the result is that sometimes neither are necessarily heard. Okay. So either stunned people into silence or, which is a mind read. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I think I said at the beginning of this that I study my own experience. I encourage people I work with to study their experience. That's where the learning comes from, rather than the theory as a starting point. And last year, and I also said in the some of the links I've been putting out recently, I would explore this Me Too theme that's really, it's gone major really on Facebook especially, about people, women, I think women particularly, I don't think it's been particularly responded to by men, I'm not sure, who have been abused in some way in their life. And it resonated for me, and it obviously resonated for a lot of people. I thought what was interesting was that someone said to me, it presupposes a lot just to say Me Too. It assumes a lot that, you know, Me Too means, presupposes we've had the same experience or something similar, that we mean the same thing by saying this. But anyway, it triggered quite a lot of thoughts for me. And I put this slide up listening because just to give you some different degrees, I think, of how that, how should I call it? Well, let's stick with the word abuse for the moment, how that can happen in language and conversationally. So last year, I went on a date with someone, and oh, on a few dates, but I went this date, and a blind date. And it was fascinating conversation. Not a great conversation, not from my point of view, because this guy that I met said, so what do you do? And I said, well, I do this, you know, I do this kind of work. And he said, oh, you mean that? I said, no, actually, no, not that, actually this. So he said, oh, okay, so you must be so-and-so, so-and-so. So you must be trained in this. I said, well, no, I'm not actually trained in that. I have this type of training. He said, oh, you mean this kind of training? No. Now, and this continued. I said, so no, not that kind of training, this kind of training. And this carried on through the whole conversation, which must have been, I don't know why I lasted an hour, to be honest. But that's what happened, was that anything that I said was hijacked. Hijacked in the sense that he used his language and not my language. So my experience was that I was not being listened to, that he was not truly, now this is my interpretation, but he was not truly interested in what I meant, in what I was saying. And it was, I found it, I was amused by it. I just thought this is quite a fascinating pattern that's repeated here. And what was even more interesting was that partway through the conversation, he said, and he used this kind of slang term, he said, this is a cracking conversation, meaning this is a great conversation. I thought, well, it might be for you, but it's certainly not for me. And he said, well, I really hope I see you again. I thought, there's no chance. The principle is that the way we do something is the way we do everything. So, and this is significant for those of you in the coaching profession especially, is that you don't need to hear what people say. All the clues are in the patterns, in the behaviour, and in the language. So, for example, now it's to be tested out rather than to be assumed universally. But it is interesting just how remarkable, you know, patterns show themselves. So if you take this pattern that he was going to overwrite my words with his, you will, so what's the significance of that in life? This could be somebody who was not going to allow or seek not to allow me to have my own interpretation, my own perception of the world. Of course I have it, but he didn't respect it. And the chances are that that respect might carry through to other levels. And I think things like that are important to spot, important to notice. And you could say that is a kind of, I mean, my experience was, if I had not been aware, I think, of what was happening, maybe I wouldn't have been amused by it, because I recognized the pattern. Maybe I could have done something to counter it that was different. Who's to say that with some feedback or whatever, he would not be different? But he was overriding what I was sharing. Whereas when he did share something of himself, I do believe that I was curious and questioned it. So I felt it was very one-sided, and that he was working on the basis that his way of expressing things and thinking about things was right. So that's a kind of, if you like, a low level, I would say, low level form of overriding, whatever word you want to put to that. I'm going to talk about a stronger level in a moment. But let's just do, if you want to put any reactions to that, do put them up. I think there's been some very interesting comments on Facebook about the different forms that, what people are saying me too about, the different forms that takes. So let's go on to another language pattern, which is connected to this as well, and is an example of what was happening in this conversation. So,
maybe I'll jump on and share my reaction, and then that may help others to come in. But yes, I think that experience, it's definitely happened to me as well. And I think the misalignment of trying to share myself, and what felt like kind of on the other receiving end of dating or other people, it's like, but do you mean this? And I noticed myself feeling really misunderstood, and that they may not want to really know. So it was two things going on. I was misunderstood, and they were maybe curious to find out. And so when you're saying sharing that, I've been in similar situations, and I find even when I was on the train today chatting with someone, just being mindful of what words I was using, to maybe use a bit more, and I'm not perfect at it, but using even one or two words of hers helped support the conversation. So I would like to know your thoughts about, the best way to be able to listen and using their words that's genuine, right?
Yeah.
Without only speaking their words. Maybe if you could share a bit on that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think where it comes from is especially important. Is that your question, Tracy? I know there were a few Tracy Livingstones came up on the text, but is that your question?
I'm just Tracy. So yeah, we have a few, but I'm just Tracy. So feel free to jump wherever you'd like. I think this is really great.
That comment says, might you be able to spot a disrespectful person from the language? Oh, it's just disappeared, that one. You might be able to, yes. I'd say notice. It's patterns. Patterns are things that are repeated. And so it's like, well, here's a part of it, here's a pattern. Pay attention to it. Is it repeated in other forms? That's the thing. So yes, you might be able to, on the basis that, yes, patterns run through all aspects of our lives. And so patterns in language. So, if you've got somebody who's consistently talking about the problem state, that's how they live their life, in the problem state, and there'll be all sorts of consequences of that. So yes, absolutely. And how can you, clean questions in the form, and there's variations on that. I gave one form of it, but I gave the basic structure of a clean question, which is to be neutral, to go with what the person's saying, to use their words, and to be curious. Now, it works, if you like, if works is the right word, if you are sincerely curious. If you're just using the question because somebody said it's technically a good idea, it's not going to have that quality. But to be almost, well, to be not knowing and to be sincerely interested in learning about somebody else's experience in the world, if it comes from that place, I think it doesn't really matter if it's technically accurate or not. It's going to have that kind of acknowledging and honouring effect. So it's where it comes from that matters. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, which actually illustrates that particular point.
Great, and I just want to add a couple more comments. Let's see. Can I ask why he would hijack the conversation is one. Another, Tracy said, I would look at what the person is not saying, the nonverbals, body language, is that person congruent or something else is going on? And yeah, and then Tracy reiterated another, I can relate, I've had occasions where I've been hijacked and I've been irritated. So those are three more comments here.
Yes, absolutely. Of course, there's other things to look at and be curious about it. Just like be aware of it. That's the first step. Just be aware of it and what might be. I can't answer the question why. Interesting enough, why isn't a question that's used very much in NLP. We look at how people create their experience. Of course, there's going to be a why, but I don't know what it is. But I am aware of the patterns and the impact that they're having. So that's absolutely something to be aware of. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So that was the pattern. So this interpretation, when two statements are linked together. So this means that, and that can be used in many different ways. It might be in conversation in the way that I described. So, oh, so you mean this. So that's a form of, potentially a form of hijack. So this means that. So that was my experience in that conversation. Other ways in which it can be used is in reaction to something that's happened. It might not be conversation from somebody else, but it might be, well, I haven't heard from him. He's obviously angry with me. So to put a meaning to an experience without actually finding out what that experience means. It's what's called, it's a distortion. It's a very human trait to put meanings to things. And again, I would say, and it's very useful at times to put, if you're in a not okay situation. I mean, I was on a very, very turbulent flight to Greece last week. And I chose to believe that we hadn't heard anything from the pilot because he was totally in control of everything that was happening. I mean, if I'd chosen to believe anything different, as I think some people on the flight were, you'd be a nervous wreck. So again, there's an upside to these patterns. There's times to use them. And the way to test that is to say, well, is what I'm doing, is what I'm saying, is it helping me? Is it taking me towards a goal that's a mutual goal that's beneficial to me and beneficial potentially to other people? And if it is, then it's probably okay. It's probably serving a purpose. If it's not, so for example, if the language I'm using is leaving me in a state of distress or anxiety or tension, then let's look at the language. Let's pay attention to the language. It may not be the best choice I could make. And that's not to say that, it is important to look at situations, but be aware that sometimes the language we use creates a reaction that doesn't help us to deal in a rational or balanced way with what is happening. It doesn't mean to say we accept what's happening, but it's like, but how do we deal with it in the most effective way? And any degree of tension is going to get in the way of that. And some language that we use on ourselves can absolutely cause that. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. All right, so, well, I said that first example was a kind of milder one. I came the closest to really losing my temper not so long ago in a conversation. I think generally, especially because of all the kind of training that I've done, usually I can stay balanced in many situations. Very different to how I would have been years ago. Now, there are times when I'm not in the state I would wish. But I think the conversation that I found myself in, I really began to feel very oppressed. I felt really bullied in the conversation, and I hadn't experienced it to that level before. And for a while, my feelings clouded my ability to pay attention to what was happening. And I managed to take a step back and realized this was what was happening. This was a large part of the conversation, that I was facing a lot of opinions expressed as fact, that this is the way it is. This is what is right. This is and so an opinion expressed as fact is that it's not being put out as an opinion, it's being put as a fact, as an absolute. So it doesn't have, for example, in my experience, the person was not saying, in my experience, what I've found, this is this. It's the very technical term in language is lost performative. It means that the performer or the owner of the opinion has been deleted. So they're expressing their opinion as a universal belief and statement. And they were coming at me so quickly, I felt extremely bullied by this. And it was exceptional. To the point when I probably usefully lost my temper. It probably would have been better if I think there was a degree of control there, but I absolutely came back on it and said, you have to, stop this right now. Stop this, because I will not be treated in this way. I will not be spoken to in this way. And it was very interesting, because I think there are times, certainly years ago, when I don't think I'd have known how to stand up. And I stood up to it a lot in this conversation. And again, it's important to ask the question, how is this a form of abuse in conversation? That's how I experienced it. And this was an overriding of me. Years ago, when I did do studies of behaviour, I found that, and I don't often distinguish women and men. I think everybody's unique and it's very important to treat people individually. But we did find statistically that women putting an idea forward in a meeting had to put it forward far more often, more frequently, repeat it than a man in order to get that idea agreed to. So their opinion, a woman's opinion, was less likely to be heard first time or second time. It had to have more repetitions to be accepted, which was an interesting observation. Now, whether that's because, and let's just broaden it out, those people, not just women, but those people who allow other people to override their ideas, obviously are not going to get theirs heard. So this is one example of a language pattern that is an overriding. It's like a universal kind of potential bullying, and it's got a value. There is a time and a place for it as well. So, for example, if you take, there's a whole section in NLP called presuppositions. I call them beliefs of excellence in my book, which are opinions expressed as fact. To say that there's no failure, only feedback, and there's a solution to every problem. Those are opinions, or they're the result of research and modelling expressed as a fact. They're not saying, I as the author, in my experience, find this. So there's a time and a place. And in this instance, I found it offensive. So
I would like to chime in. It makes me think of opinions expressed as facts potentially in different countries, or within different religions or households or upbringing. So the diversity of the world really comes out in people expressing. Just gonna move this over. People expressing their opinions as fact is potentially very deep rooted as well. So I think that's just what's coming up for me.
Yes, and again, my overriding belief in all of this is that being aware of these things means we can then begin to explore, well, what do we do? Is it appropriate to allow that? Is there a way of responding to this? In my case, it was like, how do I stand up for myself and speak my truth? And I think a lot of this comes down to truth. When we're getting below the surface with language, it's about the truth that exists behind the words on the surface.
It's really important, and it's making me think of a lot of different examples in my life of when this came up. I'd love to hear what others believe or think about opinions expressed as facts. I just want to be the mini timekeeper, that we have about 6 minutes. So we'll try to honor time. We may go a little bit over, but just Sue, so you're aware, okay?
Well, let me give you the other, let's give the other, just got a few more patterns. We can just go through them because I think that's some of the main points. So let's go on to that one, the next one, mind reading. So again, it's similar. I picked ones that I felt were connected to this, the potential of being abusive with language when it's used inappropriately. So mind reading is presuming to know what another person is thinking or needing. So what you should do is, or you're probably thinking this, as opposed to finding out and respecting what's actually happening for that other person. So I'm tending to think of not great examples in my own life. I remember having a car journey a long time ago, years ago, with someone who spent the journey saying, well, you know, what you should do, Sue, is this, and you know, what you ought to do is so and so, so and so, so, and gave me advice. And I was so glad to get out of that car because I just felt, you know, I'd been imposed. So mind reading can be useful if it achieves the outcome, but just be aware of that pattern of assuming that you know. So when someone says, well, I know why you did that, or you must be this, they're making an assumption as opposed to finding out. And it just comes back to, when is it appropriate to assume, when is it appropriate to really explore what's below the surface so that we truly understand each other and get to that truth. Okay, so next, the last pattern I've chosen to include is this one, because I think this one, and it's a technical word that's used in linguistics, nominalisations. It's giving something a name that would otherwise be an active verb. So if we talk about, I'm talking with you in this webinar, Tracy, I say our conversation. I've turned what would be an active verb into an abstract noun. I've made it something. It's a bit like the examples I gave right at the beginning. Now, I say this one because so many people, I suspect many of the people involved in this webinar and listening, are involved in change, in personal growth, perhaps change in organizations, change for themselves. And the effect of using nominalizations is that they're very static words. I find them a lot in business conversations, which is a nominalization. Business presentations, that's a nominalization. You look at slides that people use and the language that's used in when they're writing reports in business, it's very often in this form. And it's static, it's abstract, it's hypnotic, and almost counters the very outcome that people have in writing or in speaking. So if you find yourself, let's say, feeling stuck or kind of a bit lost, that could be a clue to going, well, what language am I using on myself? So when I'm coaching someone, I'll pay attention to the language that they use. And this would be one of the things that I'm listening for. So it's, again, has time and a place, but it can be used very often in a way that completely contradicts the outcome of change and changing.
Sue, we have a great question from Ren. Well, Tracy said I can relate to that one, Sue. And Ren asked, so when you are aware of linguistic patterns to the level you have, Sue, how do you cope with all the crap people throw at you every day?
All the crap they throw at me. I live a solitary life. So I live in the heart of the country in France.
You're in the mist. Yeah, we saw very misty and mountainous.
And you saw no people there. I kind of steer clear. Yeah, it is interesting. I've been to dinner parties and things and quite fascinated by the language, but there's a time and a place to do what I do. You know, it's like with NLP, time to just keep my mouth shut and just listen and be curious. Because people don't throw crap. They throw all sorts of interesting things and ideas and support, and these are patterns that I think it's to be aware of in myself more than anybody else at first. If I recognize it in somebody else, you know, the horrifying thing is that then I've got it, I do it too. So all those things I've talked about in other people in this evening, I can only spot it because in some form I've got it as well. That's the shocking thing. And here's the place where it's important for me to pay attention. So what's the next to last slide. Ooh. Oh, okay. Didn't realize I had that one. Okay, limiters and stoppers. So these are words that can create tension in ourselves. So if you recognize that you're feeling tense, these may be one of the patterns that you're using. If you're using words like should, must, try to, ought. I mean, when I say them, my shoulders go up, I tense. And the principle is that whenever we tense, if we have any level of tensing ourselves, of tension, then we are restricting ourselves in some way. We're restricting our ability to freely use the natural resources and talents that we have. Sports people know this. I don't think that's just a mind read. They know how important it is to stay fluid and flexible. And if they get to a big point and they start telling themselves, oh, I've got to get this one right. I mean, we were just talking the other evening about top snooker players, and the ones who are particularly outstandingly successful, but you could take any sport, were the big points didn't seem to be any different to the rest. They approached them the same. There was no like, I've got to get this one in order to win the game. It's very characteristic of a very open, free attitude to life, to be able to just take things as they come. And so the extreme form of that, a way of stopping yourself, is to be using words like can't, won't, words with not in them. So be aware of those and look at what you can do and what you want to do and what you want to be. Okay, so I think the last slide, back to Akrityr. So this was a picture of the team working on this village, and it was amazing to watch them. It wasn't exciting to watch because it was incredibly painstaking work. They removed most of the dust, the lava, with a brush. And I thought, well, I thought about it subsequently and thought, that's an incredible metaphor as well. The care sometimes is important to take if we want to discover the actual truth below the surface. There's no quick hacking away thinking, oh, we've got another 95% of this village to uncover. Let's crack on with it. They said, you know, that other 95% will be uncovered by their children and their children's children, if that's still happening in the future. That rushing is not the key to this. It's patience and care and sensitivity, and that's exactly what I witnessed there. And what they're uncovering are just remarkable relics of the past and of a moment in time that we can actually discover about other people's lives way, way in the past. So there we are. So if you want to go to that very last, I keep saying last slide, don't I? So you very kindly invited me to do this as a preliminary to the program I'm doing in Doha with Empower World, with Janine and Marie. And thank you for inviting me to take one area and even one small chunk of a very big area as well, and give my very personal take on it, which I hope that you found, I hope you find valuable. I hope that just that awareness makes a difference. That's my wish.
Thank you, Sue. And I have learned so much. We have one question, but let me just chime in with this slide and then we can get to the question. Please, if others have questions, chime them in now. And yes, Empower World is hosting Sue Night in Doha, which is her only Middle East location. So if you're in Doha, you're in for a real treat, or if you're close by, definitely come and join us. It will be a week-long training, and Sue will be live in action, action-packed. This was just an hour and really even about 40 minutes of NLP, and you can only imagine potentially how much you'll get out of that all day in person with Sue, Janine, and Marie. I know a few people are on the call that are going to be joining us, but we do have a few seats left. So if you're interested in registering, you have my email. Please email me and I'll get you in touch and registered. You can also go to empowerworld.com and just register there. Again, November 19th is quickly approaching. So if you are interested, please do be in touch with me. You know me, I'm a real person. You can get in touch and register for that. So I know we also have people that are international in different areas. Head to SueKnight.com. Sue, as you can attest, does NLP trainings worldwide, as well as a number of other services. So if you're not in Doha and aren't able to attend that, you may be able to find Sue at another time and location. So a lot of people are saying thank you. Thank you so much. And I see a question, if you don't mind, Sue, answering. Would you mind answering a question or two?
No, not at all.
Great.
Yes,
okay.
I'd be fine to answer.
So Ren asks, when you are aware of linguistic patterns to the level you have, oh, no, we already asked that one. Hold on. Let's see. I'm in Lebanon, so how can I follow up with the NLP seminar?
Oh, well, you could read about that. There's a lot about language patterns. There's a lot about it in many books. It depends how you want to follow up. I mean, coming to programs is one way. It's one part of a much bigger whole. You can study online. I think for me, NLP is an experiential topic. So to actually do it and practice it, there's a chasm. There's a huge world between reading and knowing about it and being able to do it. You know, you take the clean questions; they look so straightforward, but in practice, there's something else. So I do encourage, wherever possible, if people can travel to an event, to go to an event. I think maybe after this, I would do some more webinars, and I would value people's feedback, ways of making them. It wasn't particularly interactive tonight, so it was predominantly me talking, which is very uncharacteristic. I'm much more likely to be involving people when I'm training. So those are some of the possibilities as to how to follow through.
Great. And Marie Antoinette asked, to what extent the linguistic patterns are related to the cultural level, so we can just smile and accept?
So we can just smile and accept. Well, to a degree, but I think a lot of cultures are changing and challenging things. So it's a question of whether you consider yourself to be a part of that, whether you want to bring changes. I mean, I think just what's happening, with the different leadership in the world at the moment is challenging a lot of norms, and people have got the opportunity to speak up about things and be heard in ways that they haven't been before. So I just think we can each be pioneers towards ways of being and living that are significant to us personally and in the world as a whole. So it's your choice. It may be appropriate sometimes to just smile and accept what's happening. I think initially it's a way of perhaps just allowing them. So it depends on the place, depends on the circumstances. So accept maybe, or at least hear first of all before challenging.
And I have a question. You mentioned turning off kind of that NLP radar, so to speak. I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I'd love to know if you have advice or a trick or two of ways that you do, so you can just maybe enjoy where you are potentially. So is there something you can piece of advice on?
I've got to be honest, I very rarely do, but I'd switch off what I might comment about. But it's like, I think if it's like, if you're if you've trained in something, say you're an architect, you're probably going to notice buildings wherever you go. I notice behavior and language wherever I go. But a large part of what I do is coaching with humor as well. So I can have fun with it. And I think one of the goals, and take the clean questions, is to use them conversationally, not to be, very clinical about them. So I think we can be very respectful with people and join in and have fun. It doesn't exclude that. In fact, I think it does the opposite. It enables. I find it enables me to join in and have a ball. I usually have a ball wherever I go.
I like that. Just have fun with it, and enjoy. And Marie Antoinette says, I would appreciate more webinars. And a few others.
Back on it as well.
A few others have said, thank you so much, Sue, to both of us. So thank you, everyone, for sharing your wonderful comments. And a number of people are joining us in November in Doha. So again, thanks to everyone that's registered. If you're not registered, let's get you registered. It's once a year. It's the only Middle East location, and she's coming right to your backyard. So would really love to have you join. And again, Sue, thank you so much for your time and expertise, and just sharing your words of wisdom. Again, I have a few notes and things like that. So we'll be sure to get the webinar to everyone that was on the call. So you'll get the PowerPoint slides for your reference. We'll also get you that video of the recording as well. So that will come in a few days once we download that webinar. So thank you again, everyone. We'll close the webinar here. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and we'll see you in Doha. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.